Hey, what's good, y'all? Welcome back. Just wanted to dive into just some info for folks who are on the climb to get to Mythic. I think the reset happened maybe a couple days ago, so I'm sure everyone's just trying to find some time to get their rating back up, maybe trying some new decks. I know for myself, this is a little preview of a Planeswalker that I'm hoping to get some more games on and put up a video pretty soon, just because I think this is another option. But I wanted to go over really just three decks that I just highly recommend if you have the cards that is just going to get you to Mythic. It took me really like one kind of session of sitting down and playing multiple games to get there. And I mean, obviously, I was reset in Diamond, so it takes less time. But I just wanted to get some info out to folks so that they know that they can lock in one of these three decks and be pretty successful with them. So I think without too much ado, I'm just going to get into what I would recommend as the best deck to climb with. I have my gameplay on the channel it's like the second to most recent video, so feel free to look back on the channel and find that if you're not confident on sort of how to play the deck out. But to me, it's really straightforward. The only thing that you really need to be careful with Domri is just being mindful of Gaea's Cradle, like when it's going to go off, and really being mindful of when you should be keeping up mana to flip your werewolves into Moonlight. And you do want to know what your opponents are doing. I'll say right out the gate, you're going to lose to Liliana. If you're seeing Liliana on the ladder, I would switch it up if you get paired into that more of that. I actually played against like the same Liliana player maybe 3 or 4 times in a row while I was climbing. So I lost a game, I won a game, and then I was like, okay, I've seen this a lot. This matchup's really not good. I'm going to play Ral, so I ended up doing that for part of the climb, and we'll go over that deck today too. But this deck has such good game against the entire field, I feel. The two worst matchups, said this before, are for Domri, are Liliana and Teferi. Teferi is winnable. It's tough. Liliana is winnable if they stumble, but you don't really have any way to stop them from killing you with the big zombie that deals half your life total. So, you just want to be keeping hands, whether you're on the play or the draw, and I think you get an advantage on the draw, especially if you start out with Birds of Paradise, because you're getting 2 free fragile mana gems, and that really can accelerate you into really early flips on Agitator. Same with Hermit of the Flock. If you're playing into aggro, that can be really, really helpful. Or like Wurm's Wake as well, when you're flipping your werewolves and just getting a lot of tempo out of that. You really just want to be hitting your curve. So obviously mulliganing any of these 8 drops you see in your opening hand. I think there's only one time that I consciously kept an 8 drop, and I think it was like I had Channeler of Might, Craterhoof, I think, or Lava Wave, and like a 2 drop. And I was like, and it was into, I want to say like maybe Jace or like another mid-range deck, and I was kind of like, okay, I'm on the play. I'm going to see, I'm going to draw a card, so I'll have 4 cards. And the fact that I can play knowing that I have Craterhoof Behemoth in my hand is actually fine. But I really, unless you played this deck a lot, I would not advocate that. I would just say try and keep as low a curve when you're starting the game out, and then obviously just be mindful on turn 5, 6, and 7 of how Gaea's Cradle is going to look for you when it pops. You could change a couple different cards in this deck, but I really feel like this is the list that I've been happiest with. And the reason I would say playing Domri over Ral and over Kaya, who I also want to talk about today, is that it just has a very linear game plan. And when you're climbing, you want to have quick games, as quick as possible, ideally, right? So you can play more games. B, you want to be proactive. You don't want to be like responding to what your opponent's doing, because unless you're a very, very skilled player and feel comfortable doing that, you're just going to lose games where you're like, oh, they had this card versus this other one, right? Where you play control, or you play some sort of combo deck. I think I really advocate play the deck that is pressuring, that is kind of linear in terms of what it's doing, so it's not terribly complicated, and just play a bunch of games. And having the two Treetop lookouts, I definitely advocate for this because it's really going to help with the Liliana matchup early, actually stopping some of their traps. And then against a fairy, it allows you to actually play your 8-drops without getting completely blown out. So I really think against the field, this is the list that you should be playing if you have these cards for Domri. Now, you'll sometimes get draws where you draw a bunch of 1s and 2s and 3s, and then you're hitting turns 6 and 7, and you don't really have any of your 8-drops, and you're trying to just keep the pace of the game going. Keep playing. Notice when your boar count is getting high, right? So like every 5th creature you get a boar. So just notice that, like, if you go Sundancer into, Hermit of the Flock, into Wurm's Wake or something, you might have a turn where it's more advantageous for you to play a cheap creature, play Gruul Club, play your 3/2 boar that came into play and doesn't have haste, and maybe have the boar fight something, right, to keep applying pressure. So I would say the two most quote-unquote complicated mechanics in the deck is accounting for your Gaia's Cradle and when it's going to pop, for noticing how much extra mana you're getting in the beginning to maybe play an 8-drop on turn 5 or 6, and then finally just keeping track of when your boars are going to come out after playing all your creatures. So those are kind of the fundamentals of playing the deck. Again, if you see this list and you're like, okay, sure, I've played this, but I don't feel that comfortable, definitely just recommend checking out my video where I'm playing in the top 20 in Mythic before the ladder reset. Playing some tough matchups for Domri, but just it'll give you a flow for how the deck kind of is supposed to look when you're playing it out. Again, if you're seeing a lot of Liliana or Teferi, I would maybe switch to one of the other two decks we're going to talk about today, but I do think in general, in the dark, if you want to climb and get those trophy points, you can do it with this deck very easily. So that's Mr. Domri, as per usual. Domri, I know, is kind of one of the kind of boogie people of the format, so to speak, and Ral is no different. I think a lot of people are either kind of feeling a little tired about this deck, feeling that it's a little played out. Maybe some people have even moved off it completely. I see it here and there, but it doesn't feel like it's really, the most played deck from what I've seen on the ladder. But I think if you haven't played with Ral, or you've played with it to some degree of success, it's still a very, very consistent, strong deck. It has these explosive turns, as you've seen in a couple of my videos I've had on the channel. I'm a big Ral fan. But the thing I like about Domri versus Ral is that Domri just kind of does the same thing every time. And I think when you're trying to climb and save time, you just want to be very linear. And although Ral can have those draws where, like, you flip your early thing in the ice, you get your Magnum Opus or your Young Pyromancer going and you just roll them over, that can happen, but you will also get hands where you're like, I've got Spark of Genius, Warding Flame, and Shock. Okay, well, I hope they play some creatures, or I hope they do something I can interact with, because otherwise I'm going to be sitting here waiting to cast my spells. So I just think that Domri is a more powerful deck in certain terms because it's just always applying pressure, kind of no matter what's going on. Ral does have to account for what your opponent is playing, because you might have awkward turns where you're like, okay, well, I need to cast Burn Through to attack, but I also kind of need to unsummon that creature to make sure that I get my passive proc to reduce stuff by 2 so I can play my divination, right? It's like there can be awkward draws with this deck, and unless you're pretty experienced with it, it's definitely going to be a little tougher. I think the learning curve on Ral, I don't know that I would say it's higher than Domri, but I do think that there's a level of randomness to this deck that Domri does not have. And so that's why I think playing Domri over Ral, and I also feel like Domri typically has better matchups, can make Ral a little bit weaker. Now, I'm going to tell you exactly why I switched to this deck. I mentioned it earlier. I played into a slew of Liliana decks midway through Diamond. And Domri has such a bad matchup into that deck. And so if you're queuing and you're tending to queue into the same player or the same decks over and over, you should kind of either take a break, maybe walk away for 5 minutes, hope the queue kind of resets and repairs you against something else. But what I would say is you might need to switch decks. There's no best of 3 in this format. So you might need to turn to a deck that has a better matchup. And in my opinion, I don't know if other players agree with this. I think Ral has a very good matchup into Liliana. I think between Unsummon, Burn Throughs, Thing in the Ice, let's see what else. I mean, those are really the big ones. Being able to unsummon their big thing that they just reanimated, really, really good for you. Being able to Thing in the Ice, stun their biggest thing, save your unsummon for a following turn, or use your Burn Through to get damage through and end the game. Ral, to me, just has way more abilities to respond to what Liliana is doing that Domri just purely does not, because they don't have access to blue spells or blue creatures that interact with them. So that's the bonus, right? Is like Domri's less interaction, but kind of more consistent. Ral, to me, is less consistent, but more interactive, right? So I would say if you're just picking up one of those 2 decks, I would just pick up Domri. You will probably find more success with it. But if you're relatively experienced, if you're playing in not Mythic, but you play the game quite a bit and feel pretty comfortable, Ral actually might be a better deck for you, just because you know what spells your opponents are playing and how to interact with them. And Chaos Lightning, right, it can either be, you can set it up to be a burn spell, where you clear their board, stun their stuff, bounce their stuff, kill their stuff, and then Chaos Lightning them 10 to the face. Or sometimes you need it as a sweeper, sort of like a Day of Judgment that's one-sided. So there's a lot of different play patterns with the deck. And I think, if this is just more your style, go for it. I think this build is what I've really come to feel has been the most consistent for me. And you might see a couple 1-ofs with Extract Sample, right? Deal 2 damage to any enemy creature. If it survives, you get a copy in your hand. And Pyroclasm. I actually used to run 2 Extract Samples, but I think it's a little too narrow. And when I was climbing, I figured I'd run into a couple aggro decks and thought that Pyroclasm would just be a good 1-of to have. And sometimes it really just allows you to push damage through in a way that, although Extract Sample can be some really good card advantage, and it's, of course, the magic number 2, which means it'll be a free spell off of Ral's passive when you hit it, I don't know that the deck needs 1 or 2. Young Pyromancer, I had been on and off of. I've kind of really fully come around to this being, you should play 2 of this in your Ral deck. It's a really good alternate win condition aside from Thing in the Ice and Magnum Opus. And as long as you know how to sequence the spells, right? Like, you want to play Magnum Opus before other ones, you want to play Young Pyromancer before you play those other spells, you're gonna get wins with this deck. So I wanted to throw out both of those decks. I mean, surprise, surprise, right? Domri and Ral, still incredibly strong decks. Obviously, nothing about the meta has changed. It's just that ranked ladder has reset. Some people might be playing other decks. Some people might just be kind of like, all right, well, this is my season. I got really high up last time, or I was around this rank. I want to rank up. What should I do? And I just want to be as straightforward as possible with y'all. I still just think Domri and Ral are just kind of the champions of the ladder, and the games tend to be pretty quick. I mean, sometimes you'll get games with Ral that are a little clunky and awkward and take a little bit of time, but I think you should be playing one of those 2 decks if you're trying to hit Mythic. And I would say in a reasonable amount of time, in a reasonable amount of games. But I don't want to look over a deck that I think is a little bit more accessible, and I think still a really good aggro contender. And when I think about how the ladder resetting can sometimes affect the meta, it's just that people might want to play more aggro decks to climb faster, right? Or they might be bored. And they might be like, you know what, I want to play Vraska. I haven't seen that in a while. I want to play a Johnny. I want to play Jace. And I wanted to put this deck back up and highlight it, although I had one video of Gaea, so you can definitely go back and look at some of the play patterns there. I haven't played it a ton, but I still just think it is one of the more powerful aggro decks. And it's also just really cheap in terms of like gems and crafting. I think this is a lot more accessible if you're starting out than some other versions. And I think even if you sub a couple of these cards, I don't think the deck changes too much. So, if you're kind of new to the game and you're saying, Tim, I don't have these other cards, I don't have these other planeswalkers, I think Gaea is a way to climb pretty fast. So, I'm going to spend a little bit more time here just because I haven't done as much introduction of this planeswalker on the channel. The main thing you want to be looking at is Hellmouth Cave. I think that this is the best deck to utilize this card. Why? The reason is you're rewarded for playing cheap creatures, but specifically cheap evasive creatures. Lingering Spirit, 1/1 flyer for 1. Fledgling Griffin, on your turn, 1/2 flyer for 1. Silent Prowler, 2/1 with Sneak. If you go to her passive, you'll see that there's a spirit also with Sneak, right? Silver Griffin, 1/3 flyer for 2, and we'll talk about why this card is kind of an all-star in this deck in a second. Daggerclaw Imp, 3/1 flyer for 2. Okay, so you're kind of getting the gist, right? So, let's say you go 1-drop, maybe 2-drop, or 2 1-drops into Dagger Imp or something. On turn 3, when this gives +1/+0 to all your creatures, you're hitting for a ton. And the reason it's even better in this Planeswalker specifically is because of Gaea's passive. Now, this is the core of why I think this deck is one of the best aggro decks, or has been, when aggro is more viable. Because this Planeswalker is an aggro deck that has a ton of card advantage built into it. So, mission, right? So to complete, deal 3 damage to your opponent during your turn. If you do, add a random spirit to your hand and get a new mission that requires 1 more damage. So you're always starting the game needing to deal 3 damage to your opponent to get a free card. And if you look between cards like Evoke the Dawn, right, which gives something on the board in your hand and in your library, +1/+1, you've also got things like Glorious Anthem, giving all things +1/+1, Scathing Glare, which is a really powerful card in this deck. You're finding many ways to buff up your creatures so that they can get through and get that passive to get you a free card, right? And you can only do it once per turn, of course, because otherwise that would be a little crazy if you could stack it. And I would say one of the best lines of play is 1-drop, either invoke in another 1-drop, or, well, I guess the true best line is you play a 1-drop, either Spirit or Griff or Silent Prowler, and then you follow it up with Vengeful Brute post-damage to deal 2 to your opponent. That's either 3 or 4 damage right there, right? So that's a way. Sorry, we got a cat interruption here. Give her a second to get through. That's the best way to pop your passive early, right? You just need 3 damage. You're dealing 1 with one of your flyers, and you are using Vengeful Brute to deal 2. This card, people do not play like you have this card in your deck, I promise you. So if you go 1-drop, they're not going to scramble to maybe address it, or they're maybe not even going to block, even if they have a blocker for something. And then you're going to get a free card off of Vengeful Brute. So if you have a hand that's 1-drop, Vengeful Brute, and kind of anything else, you should probably keep it. That's... And I would say the best play pattern is to get the Unchained Spirit, which is a 2/1 for 2. It comes into play and stuns an enemy creature. Anything that has stun, right, or even cut down, which we'll talk about in a second, anything that stops your opponent from blocking is going to allow you to just keep getting accruing card advantage, right? Now, cut down is really important. This is a very significant mechanic in the deck. So it's 1 mana, deal 1 damage to an enemy, right? So that's creature or player. After you complete a mission, return this to your hand from your graveyard. So why this line of text makes this card very, very good. Meaning you could even just go Lingering Spirit, Griff, attack with both, cut down them, right, for 1 mana. Then you complete the mission, you get cut down back to your hand. And let me tell you, when you have 2 cut downs in your hand and you're playing this deck, you should be winning that game. Because you're getting to either kill something with 2 toughness for free, or you're just like netting a million missions. You're getting your mission every single turn and cycling these to deal damage and to get cards off of your passive. So the things you want to be thinking about is, how do I complete a mission every single turn? What's going to enable me to do that? Because as long as you're doing that, even if they're trying to fight for board advantage, even if you're thinking about, okay, I have to play around this sweeper, right, whether that's Pyroclasm or Day of Judgment or something like that, as long as you're completing your missions, you're going to keep dealing damage and getting your opponent to commit to the board. And even if they do sweep you, you're probably going to have 3 or 4 spirits sitting in your hand from all the damage you've been dealing. And one important mechanic which I missed that someone actually pointed out is that Unchained Spirit, right? So this one I would say is probably the worst spirit to get. It depends on the matchup, but in the dark I'd prefer Sneak Creature or a Stun Creature. This one is a 2/1, as they all are, and it says when it dies, drain your opponent for 2. So they take 2 damage, you gain 2 life. Now, what you can always do in this game is, if you have 5 creatures out on the board, right? What it says is you can't play anymore, right, unless you sacrifice a creature and play a creature over it, right? So it'll be like you can drag the card and over it, and it'll kind of like hover or say something, and then it just destroys it when it goes into play, and then that comes down. So what you can do, let's say I have 2 Somber Spirits in my hand and my opponent's at 4 life, and I need to close out the game. What I can do is go Somber Spirit on top of a creature to put it in play, put my other Somber Spirit on top of it, so that'll proc my first one to deal 2 damage, and then as long as I have a 1-drop or 2-drop, any other cheap creature, replace that on top of the second Somber Spirit, and there you go. You've got 4 damage. So that's a mechanic that's important. I often forget because I'm like, well, why would I want to sacrifice my creature to get another creature on the board? The answer is when you need to close out the game and you have a way of dealing 4 damage to their face without them being able to do anything about it. So that's just really important. Those are kind of the broad strokes. So it's like being able to set up good, like as many creatures getting Hellmouth as possible. Being able to set up your passive, which I think is the most important thing to understand. And then just obviously curving out, and pressuring your opponent. You might spy some cards in here that you're like, why are you playing this? So I think let's just go through the list as we kind of wrap up here for today. So Invoke the Dawn, besides a Johnny, I think this is probably one of the better decks to play this card. So giving a creature on the play, or in play, in your hand, and on top of your library or wherever, +1/+1 is just a lot of card advantage for a deck that needs to push damage to really accelerate. So often you can keep a hand where you've got a Spirit, Invoke the Dawn, and maybe like a Silent Prowler or a Cut Down or a Vengeful Brute. Perfect. You're going to complete your first mission. There's not a lot that they can do to you unless they've got a shock. That's kind of it. And we'll talk about matchups too before we go for today. Lingering Spirit, just the perfect evasive cheap flyer. Same thing with Griff, same thing with Prowler, right? And really important to note with Sneak, this is also another mechanic in the game that I didn't figure out until fairly recently. If you kill their creature, and so they have no creatures on their board, and you attack with a Sneak creature, it maintains Sneak, because it loses it if something could block it. But if there's nothing that can block it, it keeps the Sneak as a part of the keyword on the card. So I would say 9 times out of 10, if you have the option to cut down their 1-drop, play a Silent Prowler that can get a free Sneak attack without losing Sneak, probably worth it. Cranial Consultant, I still think is generally good. There are going to be draws where your opponent really doesn't want to block this thing. Even if you trade into a creature that can kill this and live, sometimes you're still going to get one of their cards that they just have to get out of their hand in order to stop you from completing your mission. And I would say conversely, if you are playing against a lot of Gaea, right, and this is Gaea aggro, because there are some lists that play the life gain land that are more mid-rangey, but against Gaea aggro, you should never let your opponent complete a mission. If you stop your opponents from completing missions, as long as the plays are still pretty decent, maybe they're not ideal, but if you're even having to trade off a creature from one of these cheap things, you should do it. Because the more cards they get to accrue through their Gaea's passive, the more ways they have to interact with you, the more creatures they have to play, and it just snowballs, right? So if you can keep them off their, let's say, 3 damage mission the first 3 turns of the game, they're going to be running out of cards, and it's going to be really hard for them to push past whatever your defense is. Cut down, again, just when you have this card in your hand, just make note, right? If you've got 2 damage that can get through, and your mission is to deal 3, cut down does the 3rd, and it comes back to your hand, right? So just make sure that you're playing, the turns when you have cut down as optimally as possible, because this card can just sit in your hand the whole game. You're playing it, you're getting missions, you're winning the game. So you really don't want to throw this away unless you absolutely have to. Thalia, I think, is still just like a fine 2-drop. It's a 2-mana 3/2 that can affect your opponent. Now, against Ral, definitely relevant. Against Teferi, against Jace, against certain mid-range matchups, definitely relevant. Not so relevant into aggro or Domri, right, or other kind of mid-range creature-based decks. So I think this slot is flexible. I think you probably could replace it with something if you need to. Silver Griffin, okay. This card is so powerful, right? And the reason why is because of the 3 toughness. It survives shock. It survives the Drain Blood, I think, which is deal 2, gain 2. And that's so important, because if this gets a Hellmouth Cave proc, it instantly turns into a 2/3 flyer for 2. And if you're using cards like Glorious Anthem or Scathing Glare, it's going to get big, and it's got enough toughness to just keep chipping it, right? And it's just really important that it survives some of the early removal that can really mess up aggro. Devoted Steed, just a really good, 2-mana 2/2 that you can give your most important creature, or the creature that's going to complete the mission, +1/+1. Right? That's why this card is here. Vengeful Brute, like I said, people do not play against Gaea aggro as if you have this card in your deck. So just know that you're going to be able to capitalize. Like, if you have a 1/1 and they've got a 1/1 and you're going to attack right early game, they might trade. It's possible. But I would almost always attack, because sometimes they'll be like, oh, they dealt 1 damage to me. Where's 2 damage going to come from in this deck to complete a mission? And then you just slam a Vengeful Brute. They feel really dumb for not blocking, and then you're up a card. So just, make sure that you're really trying to pressure your opponent in that way. Detonator, it's a 2-mana 4/4. It's going to be hard for them to deal with it. Dealing 4 damage to you doesn't really matter. And sometimes this card just really comes in clutch for, like, either trading with 2 creatures of theirs, or they, like, have to take it, maybe, if it's such a disadvantageous block. And then 4 damage is a lot for Gaea, right, to complete missions. So it's just kind of a big body to deal with. Daggerclaw Imp, one of the scariest cards that Gaea can play on turn 2, or on 2 mana. If you're on the draw, it's just a 3/1. Yes, it's susceptible to a whole lot of removal, but this thing is basically completing missions by itself, especially if you've got Hellmouth going off as well. Gaea's Enforcer, just extremely efficient for what this deck is doing, right? It's one of her signature cards. It's 2/1 for 2 with Sneak and Armor. Perfect, right? So Sneak, enabling it to attack through to get more missions done. Armor, enabling it to play on defense as well if you need to. Just a lot of card advantage comes from Gaea's Enforcer. And then these cards we'll take a second to play with. So talk about and how you play with them. So Scathing Glare is just really backbreaking. When you have 1 or 2, or if you're lucky, maybe 3 creatures on the battlefield, and you give all of them +1/+0, and all of those creatures get -1/-0, sometimes it enables you to just attack through without needing evasion. But you're running so many flyers and so many sneak creatures that this card is just netting you so much advantage, when you're pressuring your opponent's life total. Same thing goes for Glorious Anthem, right? You know, if you go like 1, 2, and on turn 3 you're thinking about Glorious Anthem, like whenever you have that 3 mana, you've got some bodies on the board, I would say at least 2 bodies on the board, Glorious Anthem is going to be really, really helpful for you. You know, getting these small +1/+0, +1/+1 on evasive creatures that are also drawing you more creatures because of Kaia's passive, it really gets out of control. And then the last card, which I know not everyone will be able to make, but if you can, this card's just a huge role player in the deck. Stoneforge Mystic just gives you access to upgrades that allow you to either complete your missions because they're pushing damage, or, you know, on defense maybe give your creature armor, or on offense give something else flying, right? Sometimes you'll have play patterns where you've played like Detonator, turn 3 you play Stoneforge Mystic, get a +1/+1 flying upgrade, turn 4 you give this thing +1/+1 flyer, it's a 5/5 flyer, what are they going to do? You know, it's going to be really hard for them to deal with it. So Stoneforge just gives your deck a little bit of modality, a little bit of choice when it comes to how to, you know, really sort of start closing out that mid-game as much as possible. So, you know, I could have gone over Teferi, I could have gone over Liliana. I think those will come up on the channel from here, you know, here and there. And I did throw up a Teferi deck in one of the quick videos I made last week. But I'm just thinking in terms of people's time and the efficacy of the decks. I think all 3 of these decks, you know, Gaea, just flip back over, Domri. Oops, Ral's always at the bottom, I forget. And Ral. I think all 3 decks just have the potential to help you climb from wherever you've been. I think they're all very powerful. Yes, it's going to take time to learn the decks. I think probably Domri and Gaea are the easiest to enter. They have the least barrier to entry. Ral, I think, takes a little bit more practice with. But I think if you're playing any of those lists, you're going to win games, you're going to climb. And if your goal, let's say this ranked reset was to hit Mythic, I think any of those decks can do it for you. I'm sure there are plenty of other decks, but I really just wanted to throw out, you know, 3 that I think are just going to really do the job, potentially the quickest and potentially the most effectively. So I'm hoping to have, you know, maybe a new gameplay video up this week, just for those who are still, you know, really learning the game or just trying to see how to optimize their, you know, their actual gameplay aside from their deck building. But I did want us to talk about some decks today to get to Mythic because it felt way easier for me to do it. I would say each season it's felt easier just because I'm really starting to understand the game a lot more. And I want to share that with other folks who maybe either are frustrated or have set different goals. And if your goal is just to, like, you know, climb up a rank, right, not necessarily to Mythic, you know, I would try some of the decks that we talked about today. You know, maybe you prefer other Planeswalkers, totally understood. But I think that if there's a part of you that really wants to be more competitive about the game, I think it is important to try and play the, quote, best decks, those being Domri and Ral. And then secondarily, I think as an aggro option and kind of more accessible, cheaper option in terms of cards that you have to craft, Gaea is just a really great, and I just find her to be a really fun aggro planeswalker to play with. So thanks for stopping by today. You know, don't forget to like and subscribe. Really grateful for all the support. I think we're almost at 50 subscribers now, and you know, we're just hoping to keep bringing more folks to the Spellslingers community. Ever since I joined Team MTGSS, and feel free to check the website. They post deck lists all the time. You know, they throw up articles there. My YouTube videos are getting posted there as well. Shout out to them. There's just so much to be excited about working with that team. If you can make top 20, you know, that's potentially something that you can join. And I'm hoping to have some really, really different, unique Spellslingers content coming up for y'all in the next week or so. So stick with the channel. Feel free to hit that subscribe button to see when those videos are up. And hope everyone's doing well, getting back to work or school or whatever it is. And we'll catch you later. Thanks so much.